Beautiful. Dr. Hoff, I am so delighted to meet you in person. I saw you once in Victoria speaking, and I have been following you since the beginning of the pandemic. You are a true hero for people like myself that chose to say no and to learn more. I have a science background, and things just did not make sense from the beginning. The clinical trials were funny and different things. So I would love to open this up for you to start and introduce yourself, and then we'll just take it from there.
Okay, certainly. Well, yeah, so my name's Dr. Charles Hoff. I'm actually did my medical training in South Africa back in the 80s. I came to Canada in 1990, and I have been a diehard rural family doctor and also done rural ER for all those years. Um, So I'm a country boy. I don't like traffic, and I usually have the motto that if any town needs a traffic light, it's too big. So I live in sleepy little Lytton in southern BC, and I enjoy family medicine because I really feel you need to know your patients really well if you're going to take good care of them.
Absolutely.
So I have known my patients now for, I don't know, some of them are almost 35 years actually. So I've treated generations of families. I used to deliver babies and do everything until gradually there's been a gradual withdrawal of healthcare systematically. And so there are very few small rural hospitals that still deliver babies.
Mm,
There's very few Canadians even having babies, tragically, but
mm,
that's a whole nother story. Um, just to introduce myself, I suppose came to public attention or the attention of some people when I became a very early whistleblower during the COVID vaccine rollout. And I have always been passionate about truth
mm,
and about transparency
mm,
and about accountability and about following the evidence.
mm,
And so I was immediately suspicious of this pandemic, that it was being massively exaggerated by
mm,
the media and that there was something more going on than met the eye because it didn't add up. It was just full of inconsistencies. Um, their doom and gloom forecasts for how many people were going to die and their forecasts of collapsing the healthcare system were all based on computer modeling. They weren't based on reality.
mm,
And so with computer modeling, you can create anything you want. And so I was deeply skeptical about the COVID shots from the word go because there was literally no evidence for their safety, absolutely none.
mm,
And so when they assured us that this was safe and effective, when the only previous clinical trials that I'd ever come across on gene-based vaccines, which were done after the first SARS epidemic, and it wasn't a pandemic, it was epidemic in 2002 and 2003. There was also a coronavirus that came out of Wuhan in China. Interesting, came from the same spot. But that one was much more lethal than COVID. It actually had a 10% mortality rate
mm,
and but was much less contagious. And so because it was less contagious, it was contained. So there were people that died of it in Canada. It came to Canada. But after that, researchers wanted to find out two things. Firstly, how long would natural immunity to COVID endure? So, in other words, could people who were exposed to that coronavirus or the other coronaviruses that we have every winter, could they actually have natural immunity to COVID? And how long would it last? Because this was very important. If you want herd immunity, you've got to have lasting immunity.
mm,
So those researchers recruited people. this was in Singapore, Duke University in Singapore, and they recruited people who had survived that SARS-1 infection. And they said to them, can we take blood from you and see if you are still immune to it? Now, this was in the first year of the pandemic, 2020. So this is 18 years later. Can we see if you still have natural immunity to it? And they found that they did.
Mhm.
18 years later, they were still immune. And then they tested those people with natural immunity to the first SARS virus to see if that immunity would protect them against COVID, and it did. So we knew that the natural immunity was durable and broad because those two viruses were only 80% similar genetically. And so it meant that that natural immunity would cover every variant and would last a minimum of 18 years. So when so I was fired from the ER after 30 years as an ER physician for saying that a person who had proven natural immunity to COVID didn't need the vaccine. And by proven natural immunity, anybody that had COVID and for whom it wasn't a big deal, less than the flu, that person had natural immunity because there were other people who got desperately ill and died. So the fact that they suddenly refused to recognize natural immunity, even if you'd had COVID, it wasn't a big deal. They were still forcing people to get the jabs and saying that that natural immunity counted for nothing was a complete absurd. It was a lie. It was not following the science, despite what they said. And here in BC, our uh, provincial health minister Bonnie Henry said, well, you need hybrid immunity, which is absurd because natural immunity is always superior to vaccine immunity.
Mhm.
So anyway, that's just a little bit of background. And so that's why I was deeply suspicious. Oh, so I should then say, after that first SARS epidemic, because this is important, after that first SARS outbreak, and it was an epidemic, not a pandemic. It was only went into certain countries. It didn't go worldwide. They tried to develop a gene-based vaccine against it, knowing that it could pop
Mhm.
out again in the future. And so they tested it on laboratory animals. I think they were ferrets. Ferrets are highly susceptible to
I,
coronaviruses, and so they made this vaccine, they gave it to these ferrets, and then about 5 or 6 months later, they then challenged these laboratory animals with the virus to see if they were immune. And they found that a huge number of them died. They either got very sick or died. In other words, the vaccine made it worse.
Mhm.
It didn't protect them. So that was the only evidence that I had for previous trials on this vaccine platform before this vaccine rollout. So I was highly skeptical that it was going to work. And so I became a very early whistleblower when I saw the harm that happened in my own patients. And ultimately, in terms of it making worse, we have seen that very clearly. And the first huge study that was done came out in 2023 in Cleveland. They followed 51,000 healthcare workers, some of whom were unvaxxed. Some had had one shot, some have had two, some have had three, some had had four shots. And at that time, the Omicron variant was the predominant variant around. And they were basically trying to show how effective the new RNA vaccine was and how those that had had their fourth shot were the most protected. And that study of 51,000 people showed the exact opposite. It
Mhm.
showed the people who were getting COVID the least were the completely unvaccinated, and that the more shots you had, the more you got COVID, which was, in other words, it showed exactly what those early ferret studies showed, that it made it worse. It literally acted like an anti-vaccine. It made you more susceptible to the disease than if you hadn't been vaccinated.
This is so important because there was so much disinformation the government put out. The
Yes.
propaganda, disinformation, the definition is to deceive through propaganda. And right from the beginning, there was so much propaganda, long
Yeah.
before the jabs came out, that it
Yeah.
made me very suspicious. And that ferret study was massive. Did they allow that to come out and be spoken about? Not at all. Everything was shut down. In addition, in
Yes.
science, when you're doing experiments, you allow other voices to come to the table. That, you test, you retest, you allow that. This was all shut down as well, which made me very suspicious right from the start. And given history, anyway, we'll go back to what happened to you as you spoke out about it, because I was following you and I was just like, yay, Dr. Hoff.
Yeah, well, so what happened to me? I suppose I was first reprimanded. I first ran into trouble with the authorities in March of 2021. So this was actually in the second or third month of the vaccine rollout.
Right.
And so, as doctors, the Hippocratic Oath is to do no harm. And so
Mhm.
we're supposed to make sure that the treatments that we're using are not causing harm. And of course, occasionally they might, that's what side effects are. But we're supposed to be watching carefully to make sure that we're actually helping people, not harming them.
Mm.
So I first got into trouble for literally just pointing out safety signals to my colleagues in my own area, doctors, nurses, and pharmacists who were actually giving these shots. Now, I, right from the start, said, I have not seen anything that makes me confident, pardon me, that this will be good. And so I will observe, but I am not going to participate in this because I don't believe there's adequate evidence of safety.
Mm.
And so when I pointed out to these colleagues of mine, and there were 18 of them, we were on a sort of a joint email chain where they were informing us of, how the rollout was going and how many people had been vaxxed, and because I live in a community that is about 70% First Nation. And so these people were targeted, them and the elderly were targeted right from the start as being vulnerable population groups to COVID because of multiple comorbidities. And so these people were targeted for getting it first. And I had huge issues because even looking at the very brief clinical trials that Pfizer or Moderna had done, they were not done on the frail elderly. And they were not done on First Nations people. And often there are genetic variants in how medications affect people. I mean, we see that in many different things. You've got to take that into account.
Absolutely.
And
I'd love to throw in something here. One of the things about the clinical trials they did that made me very suspicious is they took the control group. In regular scientific studies, we always keep a control group so we can compare. What did they do? They vaccinated the entire control group, and people were not made aware of that too. And some of them died in the
yeah,
trials. So, we were just being told all these lies. And it was like a nightmare for those of us that stood up for human rights and for health and were truthful and authentic. We were branded, um, unacceptable. I mean, the terms that Trudeau used. Anyway, we can get back. He used the same things that the propaganda that Hitler had used. Oh, shall
yes.
we tolerate these people? They're unacceptable. And it was just horrible to live through that.
It was hate propaganda. It was literally hate propaganda. They were generating hatred of anyone who called into question anything they said. If you said, masks, masks are actually harmful. One of the ways our bodies protect ourselves against viruses and bacteria is by being able to expel them out of your nose and mouth
Exactly.
to reduce the load. And if you trap them and hold them against your nose and mouth, you're going to have more other infections apart from being oxygen deprived and dehumanized. But anyone that questioned, that pointed out that even an N95 mask that is custom fitted to the correct size for you, and who had that? I mean, really, who had that? If you got the custom fitted N95 mask, that can only filter out particles bigger than 20 microns. And a coronavirus is 1.5 microns. So it cannot stop a coronavirus. Yeah, flu virus is 1.2 microns. So it was impossible to stop an airborne virus even if there was no leakage around the mask. And usually it's at least 20% of the air goes around it. So the masks made no scientific sense at all, but they were an important part of generating fear. People seeing
Absolutely.
everyone wearing masks was an important thing of saying, "You're dangerous, I'm dangerous, stay away." And fear is how they captured everybody, just with and the masks were an important part. The lockdowns were part of the fear. All of this disinfecting of supermarket buggies and conveyor, like it was absurd, wiping things down, hand sanitizer. I mean, nobody in their right mind would think that you can stop an airborne virus with hand sanitizer. I mean, it is absurd. It is completely absurd. And yet it was all part of creating fear.
Absolutely. I'd love to throw something in about the masks as well. If somebody's doing a surgery, they may keep a mask on their face to protect themselves from spittle or protect the person they're operating on. But generally, maybe if somebody's really sick and they're around their family and they want to protect their family, they might wear a mask. In Asia, they often do this. But for the average person, this just limits health. It also limits, and I think this is a very important point, connection, smiling. It
Yes.
just, I mean, I got, fortunately, I got my doctor to write, I don't need to wear a mask early on because I saw this coming. And so I would be in places like Costco or whatever, and everybody was a sea of masks, and people would be staring at me. And I would smile at people, because there was just no connection. And it was so sad. These little kids that could barely walk with masks, and you
It
know,
was
it
terrible.
was
It was
heartbreaking.
cruel. It was cruel, honestly, because it dehumanized people, and yeah, it was just this. It was, and it separated. You couldn't, to read a person's body language, you need to be able to see their facial expression and their mouth.
And six
And
feet distance between people, so no talking, no allowance to go out, to get together. And then
yeah,
telling people not to invite their unvaxxed people to Christmas dinner on TV, which, my family promptly uninvited me to Thanksgiving, to Christmas, and all that created between friends and at a time, not allowed to go to church, but you can go to Costco or Walmart
yep,
and all the
yep, yep.
non-paw businesses that shut down. I mean, the whole thing was absolutely heartbreaking. And we saw the huge wealth from what went on to those that run our world. Anyway, the whole thing was absolutely heartbreaking. And I would love you to talk about what that was like for you as you got pushed out of the emergency room. Carry on with your story. It's such a great one.
Well, yeah. So I suppose after I drew the attention of my colleagues to safety signals, and in fact, the safety signal that I drew their attention to, this was in mid-March of 2020. And it was at the point that Trudeau had ordered 60 million doses of the AstraZeneca shot, and 12 countries in Europe had shut it down for causing huge clots in people's brains and other vital organs. And so 12 countries in Europe had said this is not safe. And Trudeau said, well, it's fine for Canada. And so I was deeply troubled about that. And so I sent this email to these people to say there is a serious safety signal in Europe. I think we have reached a turning point in this vaccine rollout. Now, that was a bit naive. That was 4.5 years ago. I thought we'd reached a turning point. Obviously, nothing changed except that they did eventually shut down AstraZeneca, which was all a bit of a hoax, because if you actually look at the rate of vaccine injuries, was actually better than Moderna or Pfizer. Um, but the fact that they did it was all part of trying to persuade the public that they were carefully monitoring the safety. It was like like a sacrifice that they were willing to make it look like they were concerned about safety, when obviously they're not. I mean, here we are, 4.5, what are we, almost 5 years into the vaccine rollout, and but it only took about 1 month for the COVID shots to have broken all records for death and disability. And there seems to be no limit to how much harm it can do. And they carry on recommending it for people. So it's obviously not about safety. It doesn't matter how many people die from it. The open VAERS in the States has 38,000 people who are recorded to have died within 28 days of their COVID shot. And these are people
Could
obviously
you
for whom there's
explain
no,
for the could you explain for the listener what theirs is?
yeah. So the VAERS stands for the Vaccine Adverse Event Reporting System. And so the US, so the Canadian one is a bit of a joke because as maybe I'll talk about, I tried to report vaccine injuries and every single one was denied. You couldn't report them. And so the Canadian system was a farce, which, and it was just it was censorship of information so that they could continue the propaganda of safe and effective. But in the States, they have a regular VAERS, which can only doctors can report certain things, and then an open VAERS where nurses or other people can report the information. And so you have to report all of the medical details about the person, and you can look it up person by person, what their age was, what their other medical conditions were, where they lived. It won't tell you what their name is, but it'll tell you all of the parameters, including what shots they got and what batch numbers they were.
Mhm.
And then what happened after that. And so an injury from the vaccine was only considered valid if there was no other medical explanation for it, and if it occurred within 28 days of the injection. So in other words, something like a cancer is never going to show itself in 28 days. Um, but they take longer than that. And I can talk about the turbo cancers I've seen in my own patients. But um, so in the US, and they seem to have stopped. I looked it up last week, and the latest numbers are from August of this year. But they record 38,000 people who have died suddenly and unexpectedly after a COVID shot, and 73,000 who are permanently disabled by it. So, what other medical product out there could you kill 38,000 people and disable 73,000 and still say it's safe and effective? I mean, it seems to be there's no limit to how much harm it can do, and they carry on saying it's safe.
And isn't there a
So
general rule in medicine where if a vaccine, usually vaccines are tested for up to 10 years, like 6 to 10.
something went wrong there.
Good, good. You know,
We're back.
oh, I was just going to write call you. Perfect.
Okay, okay.
Okay.
So I'm trying to think what were we saying when it suddenly ended?
Talking about that in medicine, generally there's certain rules, like with vaccine safety, for example, if a number of people, a percentage of people are harmed by it, it's taken off the market. This did not happen this time. In fact, there was more propaganda and more push for more.
Yeah, so there hasn't been a hard standard for that, but to give an example of the previous huge vaccine rollout where the vaccine was withdrawn because of harm was in 1976 with the swine flu epidemic. And so I believe they vaccinated somewhere between 100 million and 140 million people in the United States with this influenza vaccine. And by the time they had vaccinated that many people, 25 people had died, and there were, I think, about 1,500 cases of Guillain-Barré syndrome. So Guillain-Barré is a
Wow.
disease where you become paralyzed. It's an ascending paralysis that people can die from, or you end up in a wheelchair. Anyway, this vaccine was, it killed 25 people, and they shut it down. And ultimately, when the smoke cleared and the dust had settled, I think it had killed 40, maybe. And so that was the standard. I mean, they shut it down after they knew 25 people had died from it. With the
Mm,
COVID shot, just in the States and just of the ones that have died within 28 days, it's 38,000, and they carry on saying it's safe. So clearly there's a massive change in standard. It doesn't matter how much harm it does, it seems to make absolutely no difference.
mm, mm. And it was so sad because all of this was suppressed. We were
Yes.
conspiracy theorists. We were dishonest. It was misinformation. When actually misinformation, conspiracy theorist, and disinformation are all terms the government has coined to bring through things that were not okay, that usually turned out to not be okay. With stats like that, it's ridiculous that and yet the people that I warned, and I warned a lot of people, they thought I was crazy, a lot of them, that I was
Yes.
unstable or something. Then
Yeah, but fortunately, time and truth go hand in hand,
they
and
do. They do.
maybe that is our hope for the future, is that so many people have now realized how massively dishonest public health has been,
Mm-hmm.
and the government and the legacy media, how almost everything they told us about COVID and the COVID vaccines has turned out to be untrue. Almost everything.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
And so next time around, and I'm very convinced there will be, because the WHO wouldn't have formed this pandemic treaty if there wasn't going to be a next time around. Um, Hopefully, people will be a bit more discerning and a bit
Yeah,
less eager to just blindly believe.
absolutely.
When somebody has deceived you in the past, it's very likely they'll do it again.
Mm-hmm.
And so I think that's one of the take-home messages from this, is that we need to remember who has lied to us in the past, so that we are more wary next time.
Absolutely. You know that the concerned health professionals video that went out, I got it just before the election, not long enough. And I did a post on my social media. It was an excellent video that you gentlemen did about the HPOA. But I still feel there's a lot of people that don't know. There's even some doctors
Yeah.
that don't know. And this is a crime because it's affecting our healthcare. Maybe you could talk a little bit about the HPOA and how important it is for Canadians or British Columbians, especially, to learn about this.
Yes. And so maybe before talking about that, I want to just tell a little bit about my background, because it will illustrate the huge dangers that this HPOA now poses to the public and to
Please.
healthcare professionals.
Thank you.
So so when I started to see serious well, firstly, I was given a gag order for pointing out the safety signals. But the health authorities where I live told me that I was putting people at risk by creating vaccine hesitancy. And so they gave me a gag order and told me I was not allowed to say anything negative about the COVID vaccines in my work as a doctor. So I
That goes
accepted
against
that.
everything that you stand for and you commit to as a doctor, not
Yeah.
to
No,
mention
I mean, this
personal
was,
integrity.
yeah, no, there was clearly certain things you were not allowed to speak about. It was it was very, I remember being very puzzled by it because you can't give informed consent for on any medical treatment unless you can tell the person the pros and cons, so that they can decide if they want that treatment or not. Anyway, when I saw serious harm in my own patients from the COVID shots, I sent an open letter to our provincial health minister in BC, Dr. Bonnie Henry, to inform her of the rate of vaccine injuries. And so I knew how many people had been vaccinated in my community. And I knew how many vaccine injuries I had discovered so far, and of course, some people were just toughing it out at home, or maybe had seen other doctors. But I literally wrote to her at very early on. These are after people had got their first shot, to tell her that the rate of serious vaccine injuries in my patients was around about 1 in 200. Um, and and so, which was obviously, they were quoting vaccine injuries as 1 in 100,000. And I said, no, absolutely not. And so I was able to give her statistics and numbers and tell her specifically what had happened. And so this was viewed by the medical authorities as misinformation. They denied that any of these were vaccine injuries and called me and eventually laid charges against me for spreading misinformation. So, fast forward now to the HPOA. So that started off as Bill 36. Or maybe I should just
Yeah.
mention. So
Why don't
I
you
was
connect what
charged with.
happened to
I
you
was
with it?
charged. I was charged with spreading misinformation for talking not just about what happened to my patients, but talking about the the really high rate of myocarditis and neurological injuries and sudden death. All these people that just died suddenly. Unfortunately, amongst my patients, I only had one person who just died suddenly and unexpectedly, literally just dropped dead. Was sitting on the side of his bed talking to his wife, and he just keeled over. And there were people that died in their sleep. And sorry, I just need to turn this off. And so, because the government had given massive misinformation to the people and the media and public health, and I was trying to inform people so that they could make a choice about whether or not they thought it was worth the risk of taking these shots. So I was accused of spreading misinformation. Fortunately, I managed to recruit a really brilliant lawyer here in BC called Lee Turner. And Lee managed to recruit 8 world experts to deal with each one of the areas of accusation against me. And so these people, they were people like Dr. Peter McCulloch and Dr. James Thorpe. He's a gynecologist in Florida, who has been very vocal about the terrible harm to fertility and the number of stillbirths, and what this has done to women. Because that was one of the other things I was warning people, that this will almost certainly reduce fertility in people of childbearing age. And my concern is that they were giving this to children and university students and young people, who were at very minimal risk from COVID, but yet they were forcing them to have these shots to participate in school activities and university and various things. So you have to submit the evidence that, well, the testimony that you're going to draw on in the trial, you have to submit it a month before the trial. And so when my lawyer submitted all of the expert testimonies from my 8 expert witnesses, the college, their response to that was immediately to apply for judicial notice, which is a legal tactic where they get the court, or in my case, it was this disciplinary panel of people that worked for the college, that was this jury that they had picked to discipline me. If they grant judicial notice, you grant judicial notice to certain facts, and they had a list of facts. And of course, one of the facts is that the injections are safe and effective. And if they had granted judicial notice to that, I would not have been able to even speak about vaccine injuries in my own trial. And none of the testimonies of my 8 expert witnesses would have been admissible as court evidence because they contradicted the safe and effective narrative.
Mm.
And so the college tried to prevent me from defending myself by applying for this judicial notice. Now, fortunately, by the grace of God, this disciplinary panel, and I prayed for them every day for 3 years,
Mm.
um, turned out to be just and honest people, and they did not grant judicial notice. And so when the lawyers for the college, and they had 7 lawyers working on my case, they were so determined to make a poster boy of me, of what happens to doctors that spread misinformation. When the college couldn't get this panel to grant them judicial notice, they then tried to reschedule the trial for a time when they knew my lawyer was not available, and told me I just had to get another lawyer. And I said, absolutely not. This is a highly, highly complex trial. I mean, they'd booked 3 weeks for the trial, and I don't think it was going to be enough because there was so much evidence that needed to be presented. And some of it, in my case, was 2 of my vaccine injured patients who were going to testify. And both of whom vaccine report, I had submitted vaccine injury reports on them, and they were just denied, saying, no, these are coincidences. Meanwhile, these people's lives had been ruined by it.
Wow.
So fortunately, the disciplinary panel agreed with me that this was not fair, that I now have to get another lawyer just to fit in with them. And when they couldn't change the lawyer and they couldn't get judicial notice, they just dropped all the charges. And the only reason that they've given me, the only coherent reason, is that they said this process has already served its purpose to act as a deterrent to any doctor who might wish to spread misinformation.
Oh.
In other words, I was their sacrificial lamb. I was their scapegoat to act as a warning to every other doctor out there, just to toe the party line and to not create waves. In other words, to not disagree with public health or the government.
And it's sad because that has continued on. My mother and father were in great health, working, exercising every day prior to the pandemic. Now they've had, I don't know, 10, 12 things in the arm. Um, all sorts of problems. My dad's got Alzheimer's now. My mom has had a million problems. And I've been saying, go get a D-dimer test. When they go to their doctors, they won't let them.
No,
At
no,
least,
doctors won't. They
yes.
won't. They won't even order it because,
They
yeah, no,
won't
they.
even order it. That was really interesting that you managed to get some people tested before and after the jab. Could you speak
Mhm.
about that a little bit? And then we'll get into the HPOA stuff if
Yeah.
you can.
So when I tried to report the safety signals that I was seeing in my own patients to the provincial health authorities, and they claimed without any evaluation of any of my patients that these were all just coincidences, and every vaccine injury report that I submitted was returned to me saying these are not vaccine injuries, these are all coincidences.
Mm.
I then Because one of the questions that I asked Dr. Bonnie Henry is, so how do I treat this? I don't even know what the diagnosis is. I've never seen these kind of medical problems before. These are new diseases that are being created by this spike protein. And those spike proteins aren't a human protein. They're not supposed to be in our body. They were developed in a laboratory. It's a patented protein developed by the US military in conjunction with Moderna. So this is a very toxic thing that is now in people's bodies through the shots. How do I treat this? And so, of course, I got no answer. They just said, no, it's not vaccine. It's not from the vaccine. It must be something else. I mean, they couldn't tell me what it was from, but it just can't be the vaccine.
Mm.
So, so I then was put in touch with a brilliant group of doctors and scientists, an international group called Doctors for COVID Ethics. And I had some wonderful Zoom meetings week by week with brilliant doctors and scientists who were very interested in what I was seeing in my own patients. Because I should say, 1 month after my open letter to Dr. Bonnie Henry, the College of Physicians and Surgeons in BC and every other college across Canada did the same, sent out a warning letter to every registered doctor that if you speak misinformation about COVID or the COVID vaccines, you will be investigated and, if necessary, disciplined. So, in other words, the college gave a gag order to every registered doctor in Canada to shut up, to keep quiet, to not say anything negative. Because, of course, if you said anything negative, that's what they considered information, was anything negative about you weren't allowed to say it. So people that were going into ERs saying, I feel terrible, I've got these problems ever since my COVID shot, people found it so disheartening because doctors were too scared to admit it was from their shot, but they didn't know what to do. And so anyway, getting back to the D-dimer, I then, after having discussions with these doctors and scientists and working out how these shots worked, how they were designed to work with the delivery system of using lipid nanocapsules that had previously been used for chemo, that delivery system was designed to take whatever was inside that little lipid nanocapsule to literally every part of your body. It would get into your brain and your spinal cord and your lungs and your heart and your bone marrow and every organ of your body. It could cross the blood-brain barrier. It could cross the placental barrier so that if you were pregnant, it would get into your baby. It would go absolutely everywhere. The delivery system was designed to do that. So normally vaccines are only supposed to go into the muscle in your arm, and that's where they're supposed to do their work. This was designed to go everywhere. So when we know that something is being circulated in your bloodstream around your body, it gets absorbed through the cells around the blood vessels. And most of the absorption occurs in capillaries because the capillaries are the networks of tiny, tiny blood vessels where you've got a huge surface area relative to the blood volume. So it sort of, by simple reason, we knew that all of these spike proteins were going to be made in the cells around your blood vessels and mostly in capillary networks. So with these spike proteins, when they're in a virus, in a coronavirus, they are part of the viral capsule. And that's what gives a coronavirus its name, is these little spikes that stick out like a sea urchin all over it. That's why it's called a coronavirus. They're like, it's like a little crown, like a little crown of thorns kind of thing. There's sort of these little spikes that stick out. So if you have these spikes in a cell, they form part of the cell wall because not in a virus, it's in your cells. So you're now going to have spikes sticking out of your cell. And that's how the vaccine was supposed to work. Your antibodies would come along. They would recognize this foreign protein sticking out of one of your cells. They would latch onto it and create antibodies against it, which would then protect you against coronavirus in the future. That was the theory of how this was supposed to work. The trouble is, these spikes would be sticking into your blood vessels. And if you've got a sharp thing sticking into your blood vessel, it is inevitable that you're going to get blood clots because the purpose of a blood platelet, God made us with blood platelets to stop bleeding. And the way that they stop bleeding is these platelets circulate through our blood system. As soon as they hit a rough spot in your vessel, it interprets that as a damaged vessel that needs to be blocked to stop bleeding. When you cut yourself or you graze your knee or whatever, the reason why you don't bleed to death is your platelets recognized a damaged vessel that's leaking and block it by a blood clot. So it was absolutely predictable that blood clots would form and that the blood clots would be mostly in the tiniest vessels because that's where most of the absorption was going to happen. So I then thought, so we then thought, if we how do we prove this? Because tiny microscopic clots in these vessels are going to be so small, they're not going to show on an angiogram or on a scan of any kind because they're literally the size of a red blood cell. Those capillaries are literally not much wider than a single cell, and it's too small to show on a scan. So the suggestion was made to me, and it wasn't my idea. It was actually from Professor Bhagdi, a brilliant uh, professor of immunology and virology that suggested I needed to do this D-dimer. And in this group, Doctors for COVID Ethics, there were very few practicing doctors. Most of them were scientists, and some were sort of specialized in various different things. But I was a family doctor who was sort of like boots on the ground at the work face of this happening. And I said, well, I am going to see if I can find people amongst my patients who are planning to get this COVID shot and say to them, can I monitor your shot? I am suspicious that these shots might be causing microclots. Would you be willing to go to the lab and do this D-dimer test before your shot to get your baseline value so that we've got a control for you, and then go back to the lab a week later and do a second blood test, and let's see if you get microclotting. So I started doing that, finding people to do this. And when I had got the first 8 people's blood work back, and 5 out of the 8 were positive for clotting, I was horrified.
Oh.
I expected maybe 5%, maybe less than that. When it was 62%, which was 5 out of 8, I was so horrified that I couldn't keep silent. And I had an interview coming up, and I was getting lots of requests for interview there because no other doctors would say a word. They were all terrified. And I was not terrified because I am passionate about truth and honesty. And I value the safety of others above my own well-being.
Mm.
And so I was willing to speak very openly about what I was seeing because I saw it as my duty, literally as my duty, to try and disclose that which the government and the public health was hiding from people. And so when I spilled the beans on this and told the interviewer what I was finding, that instantly went viral across the world,
Mm.
that this evidence of microclotting. And so sadly, it was about a week after that we had a devastating fire in the town where I live and practice.
Oh
And
my
my
God.
medical practice was burned to the ground. And the lab where the D-dimer tests was, I mean, everything, the ER that I'd been fired from was destroyed. Everything was destroyed. And so that was the end of my efforts, and I was trying to
I would love
um,
those efforts were so heroic, but I would love to just touch on the fact that this fire coming right on the tail of your admitting about the D-dimer tests and what you had done so far, that was an attack because it was not a normal fire. It was, I saw pictures where a car would be melted and beside it was a garbage can, plastic garbage can that was untouched. A
yeah.
house would be completely gone, the house beside it untouched. How does that happen in a normal fire? And there's been a lot of evidence of people showing when the fires in BC that happened here and Lahaina, all over the world, they can see the attacks going through on radar through these energy weapons. And
Yeah.
so I immediately thought of you and I just thought, oh my God, like there was so many of us praying for you and your safety and for truth to come out through this because I knew right away this was like a be quiet or else warning.
Well, yeah, I mean, I don't know if this was aimed at me. I mean, I really hope it wasn't. I've had 2 people. I mean, one literally a week after the fire, I was contacted by a psychic in San Francisco who told me, I just want to let you know that that fire was for you. And I know I don't consult psychics. I'm a Christian, so I that's not my world. But And then I had a Christian who claims to have the gift of prophecy, who said that the Holy Spirit had revealed to them that that fire was for me. So, I mean, I don't know whether these are true or not. The timing was very suspicious
Mhm.
because this little town that I live in called Lytton, most people had never heard of it. It's a very insignificant little town. And
My mom lived there. My
oh,
mom
did she? Okay.
there.
Okay. Well, anyway, most people had never heard of it until I spoke up, and then people heard of this Dr. Hoff in Lytton. And then when the fire happened and they saw on the media, about this devastating fire that had literally annihilated 90% of the town in a few hours,
Wow.
people said, "Isn't that where Dr. Hoff lives?" And so some people kind of thought, the timing of this is very peculiar. But it wasn't. So the first thing that the government did after the fire was to fence off and guard the entire area for 2 years. It was fenced off and guarded. And they wouldn't let people in. You weren't allowed to take photographs. Um, I'm not sure what they were guarding because it was just a devastated area. I don't know. I mean, I, anyway. I
They
mean,
did
I
the same
would have
thing in
loved to go.
Lahaina too. They blocked off the whole area in Lahaina after the fires.
Yes.
So who knows, right? We can only surmise, but there's a lot of people that have spoken out or were planning to speak out or release a film, and all of a sudden some tragedy happens to their lives. There was a funeral director who came, a whistleblower, John O'Looney, who felt that he was poisoned after he spoke out about everything that went down in London, I think at the end of December 2019. You may have seen his testimonies, but there's many others that have spoken out, and things just don't make sense. And I'm hoping that people pay attention so that going forward, they can really listen to their intuition and pray for wisdom, and not just react to fear. Because it
Yes.
seems to be that fear is what they use to get people to comply.
Absolutely. And, I mean, a very important question that was asked early on in this pandemic by those who could see what was actually happening is how is it that most people were so easily captured, so easily? And the answer is exactly as you have said, it's fear.
Mhm.
Fear is a powerful tool of control, and it literally takes away your rational thought. Once you are afraid, you seem to lose common sense. It literally it captures you. And so I think it's incredibly important that we're aware of that, because if we are not fearful, they won't be able to control us. I refuse to be afraid of the authorities.
Mhm.
I fear God, because He is the judge that I'll stand before. And
Mhm.
and He is the one. And so that is the only thing I fear. I don't fear death. I don't fear man. I fear God, because ultimately He is in control and He is the one to whom everyone will give account. And when we literally refuse to be afraid, we can't be manipulated, we can't be bought, we can't be intimidated,
Mhm.
um, and we can do amazing things when we put our trust in God rather than our own abilities or the abilities of something else.
Absolutely. And I think along with that fear goes respect, goes trust, goes love, goes care for all our human family. Those
Yeah.
things are so much bigger. I worked in health and fitness for years. I have a kinesiology background, but I've also been studying somatic healing and did a lot of upper level psychology as well. And people are very afraid, but there's a lot of techniques that can help people. And before we end this video, I would love to talk about ways of doing that, ways of keeping our mental health, because they just seem set on ruining people's mental health. and the importance of faith, the importance of trusting in love, trusting in, and if you don't want to believe in something out there, the highest expression of yourself, which believes in love and truth. And, you know, I just think that we need to inspire people to do the right thing and to trust in God, to trust in love, to trust in beauty, to trust in goodness, do the right thing because they haven't finished with us yet. And now
No,
they're
you
talking
haven't. No,
digital
no.
IDs. And before I get into that, though, we've got the HPOA to talk about.
Yeah, so the HPOA, so I said I'd give a little bit of background about
Yeah,
my accusations of spreading misinformation. And of course, when they couldn't bury the evidence, they just dropped all the charges. But the HPOA, so it started out as Bill 36. Bill 36 is the work of our socialist NDP government in BC. Um, it was, it seems to have been written by Adrian Dix, who was our health minister at that time. His name is on it. So the most troubling parts of this, so this was pushed through the legislature with less than half of it ever even seeing the light of day. In other words, they debated less than half of it and then just rubber stamped it. It's a massive document of over 400 pages. And so, amongst all of the bits that they never even looked at before it got its rubber stamp, is this legislation that says that if a healthcare provider, and this covers doctors, dentists, nurses, physiotherapists, occupational therapists, psychologists, any healthcare or allied healthcare provider, if they're guilty of misinformation, they will get a $200,000 fine plus 6 months in jail. Now, as I previously mentioned, well, there's no definition of what misinformation is, but simply misinformation is anything the government doesn't agree with.
absolutely.
So, so I was charged with spreading misinformation for talking about what happened to my patients because they didn't agree that that was from the vaccines. They said, no, it's all coincidences. And by the way, just from the COVID shots, I have 32 vaccine injured patients in my one-man practice from the COVID shots. That's not talking about all the other shots and the devastation they have done, but just the COVID shots, 32. So if you have a professional corporation, I'm Dr. Charles Hoffe Inc., I get a $500,000 fine and 6 months in jail.
Oh my gosh.
500,000. So now, so there are a couple of other things. So that's the first thing about this, the Bill
And I'll
36.
just throw in, if you could mention why you did an ink, because I've heard a lot of doctors incorporate for certain reasons. And so people understand why, that most doctors in BC often do this and why. Why would you
Well, I
incorporate?
mean, yeah, I just did it for tax reasons
Yeah,
because, yeah, it's purely for tax reasons. Then you get your corporation gets taxed. You get taxed at corporate rates, and then you
right.
become an employee of the corporation and you pay yourself a salary. But it's a sort of a tax maneuver to try and reduce your tax burden so that everything you earned is not 43% tax, which
Exactly.
is
And
what
I've
would
heard
other.
that most of the doctors in BC are incorporated, which means $500,000. Who has $500,000?
Well,
Uh,
and for
and
misinformation. I mean, what's
for telling the
misinformation?
truth, for telling the
Exactly.
truth. It's a way to silence freedom of speech, and this is so huge because we can talk possibly at some point about the efforts going on now to silence people. Look at what's happening in the UK. They have almost 15,000 people in jail now. Some of them for liking a post that the government considers misinformation, or for liking a post that could be considered hateful to someone. We can't afford to stop talking in these times.
Yeah. Yeah. No, exactly. And the trouble is these draconian things are to intimidate people into silence. And so it's incredibly important that we must be refuse to be intimidated
Absolutely.
because otherwise we become part of the problem.
Absolutely.
So, I mean, the other things about the HPOA, one of the things that it does is it puts in place legislation that any healthcare provider can be mandated to have any vaccine at any time as a licensing requirement.
Oh,
So, in other words, if you want to be a healthcare provider in BC, you have to give up autonomy over your own body to the college, who will decide what you will be injected with next.
oh.
So this is just absurd that they can, I mean, because mandating any medical treatment is completely unethical.
Mhm.
Informed consent, you're supposed to be able to choose what medical treatments you want.
Mhm.
And that nobody should be able to tell you what you will be injected with next. So the fact that they put this as a licensing requirement, no doctor in their right mind should be in BC. But not only that,
True.
another part of this is that if they claim to have received an anonymous complaint against a healthcare provider, they can instantly suspend your license with no investigation.
And it's anonymous, so it could just be the guy
Anonymous.
saying that let's suspend him, let's suspend her.
Exactly.
Also, it's given them the right, I've heard, to go into offices and pull files, so no more
Yes.
privacy for the patient. What is this
Yes.
going to do to healthcare, here? I've heard doctors are leaving British Columbia because of it.
Well, they should. No, they really should. And if any doctor's thinking of moving here, they need to learn about this bill and go somewhere else, because nobody in their right mind should be working under this. When I consult with a patient, they are under the assumption that what they tell me is confidential between me and them,
Absolutely.
and that their medical records are preserved. Under this bill, the college can come in and seize all of my medical records at any time, which means that nothing is confidential anymore.
Mm.
Um, this is a massive, it's just medical tyranny on,
It absolutely. One of the
uh,
things I saw in that bill that just I found absolutely shocking was that the doctors cannot actually give their honest opinion. They have to give the pharmaceutical opinion. So a pharma says, make sure everybody gets their shots. You can't
yeah,
say, well, there's been a lot of vaccine injuries. I'm not comfortable, and tell your pregnant patients that I don't advise, getting a shot while you're pregnant. You go to jail. I mean, how can a patient feel protected by their doctor when they've been threatened not to tell the truth, but instead to tell what the health authority wants you to tell? After what we've
yes.
seen with COVID, how can we actually believe that? And this is in law. I was hoping that the Conservative Party would get in the last election because they were not wanting this bill to come in, but it
No,
was
they were going to
suppressed.
scrap it. Yeah, yeah.
It was so suppressed, you could not get that concerned health professionals video. It got taken down. My post got taken down. Um, and because we've got such a strong hold of compassion here on the West Coast and more of a democratic leaning, people just didn't know. If British Columbians had known what they were doing to doctors, what they wanted to bring in, because it's part of even this bill C-63 that they tried to bring in, that Trudeau was bringing in to silence us for freedom of speech. It's exactly what's going on in the UK now with all those poor people in jail
Yeah.
for
No, it's
innocent
appalling.
charges.
But this is characteristic of any tyrannical regime, is censorship. Fear and censorship and it is the way that they control people, and so the first thing that goes is freedom of speech.
Absolutely.
Hence all the gag orders. And of course this whole idea of misinformation, the biggest of spreaders of misinformation were the government themselves, and yet they
Absolutely.
persecute other people for spreading misinformation.
Absolutely. And if we look at like some of the great presidents of the state, Thomas Jefferson and others, there's a million quotes about freedom of speech being the ground that we have to preserve. And I've got a t-shirt that says something along those lines, and I've got a hat that says do not comply. And
Yeah.
I mean, it's so important that we don't allow fear to shut us down at this crucial time, because we, the people, are the stronghold. If we
Yeah.
walk in love, with a close walk with what is right, we don't need to fear anything. They're a very small percentage, but we have to continue to talk, because that's the one thing that will shut this down. Matthias Desmet was so great with his results that he found about mass formation during the pandemic. And the
Yes.
one thing he says to prevent this is to stay open, to stay honest, to talk about it, not to let fear shut you down.
Absolutely.
That's
No,
what
it
you did, and that's what we applaud you for. And that's what I've been doing since that time too. And it's a beautiful thing, because no matter what they do to us, they can't take away our peace of mind. They can't take away our
no,
faith.
exactly. No, exactly. And you know that Christ said the truth will set you free, and it truly does. And that's what this all of this restriction of information is, to hide the truth from people and to be able to manipulate the truth, and to just it's truth is incredibly important. It is a wonderful concept. And of course, what's taught in universities and schools now is that, well, truth is all relative. Each person has their own truth, which is completely absurd. I mean, if you
Like a
think of the
woman, just
logical,
like a woman is relative, you know? Yeah. I mean,
no,
it's
it's
just getting
absurd.
so silly. It's
Yeah,
getting so silly. But people, because fear has been spawned and this censorship, people are afraid to say what they really feel. And it's
yeah,
actually often the most traumatized people that get pulled into these areas, and they're just lost emotionally, and it's heartbreaking. It really is. So those of us that have a grasp on um, feel good about ourselves, because we live and breathe what we believe is truth, that we have a close walk with God. I think that it's so important at this time that people rekindle their faith. In fact, I've even heard that that's one of the things that these shots want to do, is to make us more transhuman and less able to hear the voice of God. Like when we feel troubled and we pray and we feel this peace come over us, that's a gift. That's it. That's a great gift. And so many people don't know that. There's this is a little bit of a side thing, but a beautiful anthropologist, Tanya Luhrmann, did a number of studies in Christian churches, and she talked to people about faith. And she found that the more people prayed, the more people read their Bible, or had prayer groups, the more they had little miracles happen. The more faith they had. I was raised Catholic, and I had a number of really painful things happen growing up and in my young adulthood. But I continued to pray and believe, and I had miracles. And I've had people say to me, "Well, why did you have these miracles and I didn't?" And I have no answer for that. But my suspicion is what Tanya Luhrmann, this anthropologist, has found, that through continuing to pray, miracles happen. Little
yes.
miracles, synchronicities. It's like God is working miracles. And so, one of the reasons I admire you so much is because your integrity has been so strong, and also your walk with God, which you've made vocal at times. And I think people need to hear that, because I think we need a return to doing the right thing, believing in
Yeah.
love, in truth, in beauty, in goodness, and trusting in God.
This pandemic was a moral integrity test.
Mm,
And the medical profession and the legal profession and the police and the legislature, they failed abysmally. I mean, just appallingly, the moral integrity test, where they did things that they knew were wrong, and
absolutely.
they did things that they knew were dishonest, and they willingly um, trampled on people's rights and trampled on the truth in a peculiar way. There was like some dark force that seemed to just take over, where um, people who previously were seemingly morally upright became appallingly morally depraved. And doctors before this pandemic would never have agreed that it was ever right to force anybody to have a medical treatment they didn't want. And yet they just went along with it. I mean, so what happened? And so I really think this was a spiritual war where the forces of darkness literally just enveloped people and
Absolutely.
captured them. And I think this is a time for turning to God. In this pandemic, we have seen the first time in human history that we've seen every single nation across the planet, almost without exception, follow the same deception, the same narrative of fear and lies and trampling on the rights of its people and just so evil, all following, just marching in lockstep together. And so I truly believe that this is a spiritual war. It is literally a war against humanity to alter us. I mean, we now know that those shots had the capability to genetically modify people.
Mhm.
And before that, we were concerned about GMO foods. But yet people who were concerned about not eating GMO foods are probably now genetically modified
Mhm.
because you've got now foreign DNA in your body that shouldn't be there. And so people have been altered by this, sadly. I mean, we know it has altered the way people think. There's a much higher level of fear and anxiety and depression than before. And we saw this clearly in the stats from the US military, because they used to have to
Absolute Department of
do,
Defense had very good stats. It shocked me that the jabs kept going on after that, after they came
yeah,
public with that. And the fact it wasn't on the mainstream news, you know,
not a thing. Yeah.
terrible.
Yeah, I mean, that was a control group where we knew what the level of all those things was before, and then we knew what it was after.
And they were
So,
young,
but
fit,
yet they they
healthy. Yeah.
they immediately try to cover that up and withdraw all that stuff. But it spoke volumes, and so this has changed people. It's changed the way they think. This is an attack upon humanity, and it is very dark.
You know, it's interesting. When we were kids, I don't know if you had this in South Africa, but we would see cartoons with a devil on one shoulder and the angel on the other. And the angel represented our conscience or our connection to God, doing the right thing. And the devil would be the one that was attracted to fear, to greed, to power, to violence, to all these horrible things. Which, if we look in the world, the way that our governments are going and the way that the elite are kind of moving towards is that much darker area. And I have heard, and I have no proof of this, that the shots have made it easier for people to tap into thought forms that are being streamed through some of the things like, oh, I've got fearful thoughts. Well, anybody that struggled with an addiction, say, that gives in, if we use addiction as a metaphor for the devil, the more we act on the addiction, the greater it grows. And this, everybody who's ever struggled with an addiction can see that. We look at, and it's heartbreaking because it's the way the fear grows. You know, the way that the mass formation is when people have a sense of anxiety about things they can't quite put their finger on. There's a virus going around. There's not as much connection. There's too much consumerism or superficiality and not enough true connection with others, and they don't feel connected. All of a sudden looms the solution. It's a vaccine, or it's a new form of money, a central bank digital currency. It's a digital ID where the government will take care of us. They will spring something else fearful upon us, and they will provide a solution. And one of the reasons I really wanted to do this talk today is because it's so important for us to be centered in goodness, in love, in God, in beauty, in all the integrous things, so that we don't fall victim, and to find people that are talking and not to be afraid to speak out.
Absolutely. No, and but people need to be mindful. They need to just realize what's happening to us
Mm.
so that they can, because otherwise we will just be puppets again on a string and be so easily manipulated. People need to think about all of these things that you've mentioned so that we are wiser next time around. Um,
Absolutely.
and and
One of the things that you work with a lot of First Nations people, I've always had a very strong love for the First Nations people. I grew up in Deep Cove, North Vancouver. All the Indigenous kids went to school with me, the First Nations kids. Um, and just all the things that have happened over the course of time are heartbreaking. But now we're seeing something in BC and all over Canada where the First Nations people some of them are wanting to reclaim the land that was taken from them. And there's other First Nations people, elders who are saying, wait, this is colonialism all over again. Don't get pulled into that. Because there's a law set that after, the land acknowledgement, after 7 or 8 years of repeating that, that land could be returned to the First Nations people. Um, the way that I see this is it's a horrible thing that is being perpetuated on all the people to create more division because they love to create division with these things. Use the First Nations people as a scapegoat, and this government that has siphoned so much of our wealth since, well, forever, but since the beginning of the pandemic, particularly, they have got it written into law that if the First Nations people cannot pay off all the mortgages for this land they take over, it gets forfeited to the bank, the World Bank and BlackRock and Vanguard and all the elite. So they're just basically stealing all the land. It's not the The First Nations people are being used as a pawn, in my humble opinion. And it could build more racism. It could build more heartbreak. And, when we're traumatized, and I know this from working in somatic healing, we can sometimes grasp onto something that we think gives us a bit of power. And sometimes that
yes,
thing is money. We've made money a god in our world instead of it being where it really should be: love, kindness, goodness, integrity, honesty, God itself. And I think that Canadians really need to wake up and see the big picture of this, not just, are they going to lose their land and hate on the Indigenous people when there's already 7 times the rate of Indigenous people in prison now. They've been through terrific trauma, yet we've all been through trauma. And our why we're here, who knows? Perhaps it is to heal that trauma and to gain a closer walk with creation, with love, with goodness. Because all the people we admire most were people that did that, including
yes.
Jesus, right? Who stood up for what was right and has been such a personage of inspiration all these years.
And yet, he was hated by the people whose hypocrisy he exposed.
Absolutely.
Um, and so,
By the
you would
elite of his time.
exactly. I mean, so if one's getting opposition from the authorities, it obviously one is viewed as a threat to them. It's not because one is wrong, it's because you're viewed as a threat to them. And I mean, that's what happened to Jesus Christ. He went around for 3 years healing the sick, feeding the masses, giving sight to the blind, restoring people's hearing, and raising people from the dead, and talking about truth and honesty and repentance and connection with God. And yet the authorities hated him so much that eventually they murdered him. And so if you do what is right, you will frequently get opposition by those that love darkness. People who love the darkness hate the light, and that's why they hated Christ,
Absolutely.
um, because he was light. I mean, he just revealed truth, and he showed the evil and the hypocrisy of the elite of his day.
For sure. And you know, it's interesting, but the more trauma people have, often the more it can, if they don't heal, if they don't do what they need to do to heal, it can pull them towards the darkness. And
Right.
these elite that are running our world, um, a lot of them have been raised with emphasis on power, on greed, violence. I mean, human trafficking is coming to light more. Um, I studied, I've been a yoga instructor for decades, but I studied yoga for trauma sensitive people. And there were a number of people coming through there that were abused, and a lot of times it related to our leaders. It went back to some of our leaders. Not that all the politicians are in on these horrible things, but perhaps some of them have shut off some of their conscience, some of their ability to feel emotions, so that it nothing holds them back from just plowing into power over humanity, which is obvious. Look at our world, you know? Look at what's going on in Gaza and Ukraine, and look at it's ridiculous. Everything. We need each other. We need to unite. We need to fight against division. We need to love our First Nations people. We need to love everybody. And this isn't about racism and special groups. It's about they want us to think that, but we really all need to come together and do the right thing at this time.
Absolutely. Yeah. Well,
There
I think we've
anything you
covered
would
a lot
like
of
to
we've
add? Is there anything you would like to add? I think you were just saying we've covered a lot of ground. We really have, and I would like to say for myself, I am so inspired that you have spoken with me today, and people need to hear this. I thank you from the bottom of my heart. Is there anything you would like to share before we end this talk today?
um I think the take home message in this is that we mustn't forget the past. Unfortunately, that's why history repeats itself, is because people don't know history. They forget about the past. And of course, in this digital age where people rely on the internet and digital platforms, it's easy for that information to be manipulated and twisted and distorted so that we get misinformed. And so, I mean, I'm a lover of books and things
Mhm.
like that because um, somebody can't hack into your book and edit out, or rephrase the parts that they don't like. Whereas if you're relying on digital platform and AI and all of that sort of thing, it can be very easily twisted, manipulated. So we need to remember what has happened these last 5 years so that we will be wiser in the future. And I think the most important take home message is to be a critical thinker and to refuse to be fearful. Because once you're fearful, you won't think, your critical thinking is going to disappear. And so we need to carefully evaluate and prayerfully ask God to give you wisdom, because this is a spiritual war. And it's sort of a war against truth. I mean, the fact that we've got all this new jargon about fact checkers and um, misinformation and disinformation. This is a war against truth where they're trying to alter the information that everyone gets. And so we need to look for the inconsistencies. That's what made many people aware early in the pandemic that they were lying to us, is the inconsistencies. I mean, for many people were able to see things like what is the purpose of restricting travel to stop the spread of a virus that's already everywhere? I mean, it is absolutely brainless. You can't, or what is the point of restricting travel across a border? I mean, that's why the truckers went to Ottawa. They were protesting against having to quarantine every time they crossed the border. I mean, firstly, quarantining healthy people makes no sense in any case. Not only that, when you've got the same virus on both sides of the border, what are they trying to restrict? I mean, it is absurd. And so people need to learn to be able to think clearly so that they can pick up these absurd logical inconsistencies and see who's telling the truth.
Absolutely.
And of course, any information we get from our television or from anywhere, we need to constantly wonder if it's true. And that's what, people say to me, what do you think about what's happening in Ukraine or Israel or some other place? And I say, well, what do you think they're not telling you?
Mm.
Because that's often what it is. They will just tell you part of it that will lead you to completely the wrong conclusion. You need to look behind the curtain, like I did looking at the ferret studies. When they said they were going to roll out vaccines that were mRNA based, I I did some careful research to see what the history of this was, which enabled me to critically evaluate what they were telling us. And it didn't take me long to realize that this was a pack of lies that they were telling us. But unless you take the time to look behind the curtain and to find out what the real truth is, you will be deceived and you will just be a puppet on a string and you will fall victim to it.
There is so much effort now to distract people. So many people no
Yeah.
longer have presence. When I'm a longtime meditator as well, 40 years. And when I look people, I look them right in the eye and I connect. There's presence there. So many people have lost that and they're just on screens. I was on the SkyTrain in Vancouver the other day. Not one person wasn't on their phone. And I'm looking around thinking, this is not the world I grew up in, you know? We have to fight against, get in nature, talk to each other, do beautiful things, sit beside a river and give thanks and reconnect to all these gifts that creation has given us. Those messages are so pertinent to fight about our against the stuff of these times. It's not even just the pandemic. It's the last 100 years. Look at what happened in Russia, the Gulag Archipelago. That is a fantastic book. I studied history. I was shocked. The book Ordinary People, how things took off in Germany before the Second World War. Horrific. Some of these things, what happened in Cambodia, what happened in China. If we think our government wouldn't hurt us, we need to do some research and look, even we need to do our homework and do everything we can to come together as each other
Yes.
and do the right thing because they cannot move us more and more into a digital world which will start off sounding, oh yeah, that sounds safe and this and that, but pretty soon it was a complete, they've got you around the throat. If you don't get another jab, they cut off your money. You can't feed your kids. If you don't do this, don't do that. We need to realize that they are trying to have us distracted. And what we need to do is to go into silence, go into stillness, to breathe, to pray, to bring it home to what is the right thing to do, the simple things,
Mhm.
and come back
Yes.
together and
Yeah.
unite and say no to what's not right.
Exactly. Exactly.
Oh, this has been
Good. Well, thank
such a
you for this
pleasure.
discussion. It's been a good discussion, and so thank you.
Oh, thank you so much. I'm so grateful. Honestly, you're a hero to me.
You- I don't feel like a
Oh,
hero. I'm just a very ordinary person, but I've done
oh,
what I believed was my duty to my fellow man, and maybe this is a parting thought. People has asked me why was I willing to do what most other doctors would not, or what most of the people would not. And I said, just because of the Christian ethic of considering others more important than yourself.
Mm.
That that is, Christ wouldn't have gone to the cross if he didn't consider others more important than himself.
Mm.
Anybody that has been willing to make sacrifices only does it because they consider others more important than themselves. And so we need to get out of this selfish mindset where so many people that just complied, they did it because they were just looking after number one. And we need to get out that this mindset that we have a duty to protect and serve one another. And we will have a much nicer world if everybody had that mindset of protecting and serving one another. We would have a lovely country if people would get there.
Oh, for sure. And I think another aspect of that is when we have a lot of trauma and a lot of wounding, we don't feel as whole, and we may search for it through money or power or greed. But the answer is always in our heart.
Yes.
And if we instead we focus on doing our healing work, feeling our feelings. We were not taught how to feel. A lot of times when we were sad, we weren't held. It's okay, baby. You're going to get by. Just breathe. Just breathe. We weren't all given permission to know how to feel and how to heal. And that is pertinent right now. We have to feel. We have to feel the fear, and then it goes past us. We can't
Yes.
distract ourselves out of it. And that's what people are trying to do. We have to stop, and we have to feel, and we have to love each other. And that's how we create the beautiful world we know is possible.
Absolutely. Good. Well, thank you,
Lovely.
Neda. Thank you. Thank
Thank
you.
you